The ink was still drying on the deed when William Hayes stepped out of the Clatsop County Recorder's office into the gray November morning. Rain hung in the air without falling, the kind of Pacific Northwest mist that soaked you through before you realized you were wet. He stood on the courthouse steps, 57 years old with a back that ached in weather like this, holding a manila folder that weighed almost nothing but felt heavy as an anchor chain. Inside that folder were 3 pieces of paper that said he now owned the Brennan shipyard, 7 acres of waterfront property, and 40,000 square feet of corrugated steel and rotting timber on the eastern edge of Astoria, Oregon. The building where men had once built Liberty ships that carried soldiers across the Atlantic, where welding torches had burned day and night through the war years, where his grandfather Emmett Hayes had worked alongside men who would later pretend he had never existed. Will looked down at the papers. The purchase price stared back at him in cold numbers, $8,500, everything left from his disability settlement after the accident that had crushed 3 vertebrae and ended his career at the port of Portland shipyard. Every dollar he had managed to save in 35 years of welding, gone in a single signature. His ex-wife would have called him crazy. His son Marcus had called him worse than that. 3 years ago at the last Thanksgiving dinner they had shared before silence replaced what was left of their relationship. Will could still hear Marcus's voice cutting through the noise of the restaurant, sharp enough to make nearby tables go quiet. You are so obsessed with some grandfather you never met that you cannot see your own son standing right here. The memory made Will's jaw tighten. He slipped the deed into his jacket pocket and walked to his truck, a 2008 Ford F-150 with 200,000 miles and a passenger door that did not quite close right. The engine coughed twice before catching. He sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at the rain that had finally begun to fall in earnest. From his wallet he pulled a photograph, corners soft with handling. The image faded to shades of sepia and gray. A young man in work clothes stood beside a massive ship hull, arms crossed, chin raised, eyes full of something that looked like pride. Emmett Hayes in 1944, 26 years old, first-class welder, one of 3 black men who had worked at Brennan shipyard during the war. One of 3 men whose names had been carefully removed from every official record, every photograph intended for the archives, every list of workers who had built the ships that helped win the war. Will had grown up hearing about Emmett from his father James, late at night when the old man had too much whiskey in him, and the stories spilled out like water through a cracked hull. Stories about a grandfather who could weld a perfect seam in his sleep, who could read metal like other men read books, who had worked beside the best shipbuilders on the West Coast and made them look like amateurs. But when Will had tried to verify any of it, when he had gone to the Historical Society and the Naval Archives and the Union records, he had found nothing. No employment records, no photographs, no proof that Emmett Hayes had ever set foot inside Brennan shipyard. It was as if his grandfather had been erased from history, with the same precision he had once used to weld steel. Will put the photograph back in his wallet and pulled out of the parking lot. The drive to the shipyard took 12 minutes through streets that had not changed much since he was a boy, past the Maritime Museum with its rusting anchor out front, past the Norwegian Lutheran Church where his mother had dragged him every Sunday until he was old enough to refuse, past Grace's Diner, where he had eaten breakfast every morning for the past 3 months while he scraped together enough money to make his offer on the property. The shipyard sat at the end of Marine Drive, where the street turned to gravel and the buildings gave way to lots overrun with blackberry vines and Scotch broom. A chain-link fence marked the perimeter, sagging in places, torn open in others. Will pulled up to the gate and killed the engine. For a long moment he just sat there, looking at the building that was now his. The main structure rose 4 stories high, though half the roof had collapsed years ago, and the walls leaned at angles that made his welder's eye wince. Rust bloomed across every surface like iron flowers. Windows were broken or missing entirely. The massive sliding doors that had once opened to allow ships to be rolled out on rails now hung crooked on their tracks, gaps wide enough to see through into the darkness beyond. It looked like a shipwreck that had somehow washed ashore and been left to rot where it landed. Will climbed out of the truck. The wind off the Columbia River cut through his jacket, carrying the smell of salt water and diesel fuel and something else underneath, something older. Creosote and rust and decades of accumulated decay. He walked to the gate, which stood open, the padlock long since broken. His boots crunched on gravel mixed with broken glass. Somewhere inside the building, metal groaned as wind pushed against it. He had called the county clerk before making his offer, asked about the history of the place. The woman on the phone had sounded bored reading from her screen. Brennan Shipyard, built 1919, expanded 1942 for wartime production, closed 1978 following the collapse of the shipping industry. Last owner Joseph Brennan died 1992, no heirs. Property in tax default since 1995. Multiple attempts to auction, no buyers. Scheduled for demolition in 2019, but county ran out of budget. No mention of the ships built here. No mention of the men who had built them. Just dates and defaults and the slow, bureaucratic march toward oblivion. Will reached the main doors and stopped. Up close he could see the craftsmanship that had gone into their construction, the way the steel plates had been joined with rivets the size of his thumb, each one driven home by hand. The work of men who had known their trade, who had taken pride in making things that would last. He put his hand flat against the cold metal and felt something shift in his chest, a sensation like a lock tumbling open. "I am here, Grandpa," he whispered to the wind. "I am finally here." The doors shrieked when he pulled them open, metal scraping across concrete, the sound echoing into the vast space beyond. Will stepped inside and the world changed. The interior of the shipyard opened up like a cathedral built for industry instead of prayer. The ceiling soared 50 feet overhead, supported by steel trusses that crossed and recrossed in geometric patterns against the gray light filtering through gaps in the roof. The floor stretched away for what looked like a football field, concrete stained with decades of oil and rust, marked with the ghost outlines of machinery that had been removed and sold for scrap. Along the left wall stood a row of welding stations, 10 of them, each one a small fortress of steel plate and fire brick. The torches and regulators were long gone, but the tables remained, their surfaces scarred by thousands of hours of work, pockmarked with burn marks and scratched with measurements and calculations. Will walked to the nearest one and ran his hand across the steel. His fingers came away black with grime. How many seams had been welded here? How many tons of steel had been cut and shaped and joined? How many men had stood in this exact spot, mask down, torch lit, creating the bonds that would hold a ship together through North Atlantic storms? Overhead, the crane system still hung from the ceiling, massive I-beams that ran the length of the building on rails, hooks and chains dangling like the skeleton of some great mechanical beast. Will could imagine them in motion, lifting steel plate that weighed more than his truck, moving it with the precision of a surgeon's hand to where the welders waited. He moved deeper into the building. The smell grew stronger here, rust and mildew and something almost sweet, like old machine oil mixed with wood rot. In the far corner he found what looked like a boat hull, wooden ribs curving up from a keel, the whole thing half collapsed and covered in moss. Beside it were stacks of lumber that had turned gray and soft, home now to colonies of mushrooms and insects. But it was the wall that stopped him cold. 20 feet long and 8 feet high, covered in metal lockers, the kind with vented doors and combination locks. Most of the locks were broken or missing, doors hanging open to reveal emptiness. But the nameplates were still there, brass rectangles screwed into the metal, each one engraved with a surname in block letters. Will walked along the row slowly, reading names like a roll call of ghosts. O'Brien, Kowalski, Delacroix, Svensson, Martinez, names that spoke of immigration and assimilation, of men who had come from everywhere and found common ground in the work of building ships. At the far end of the row, in the corner where the light barely reached, 3 lockers stood together. The nameplates on these were tarnished almost black, but when Will rubbed his thumb across the first one, the letters emerged from the grime. E. Hayes. His breath caught. He stood there with his thumb still pressed against the brass, feeling the grooves of the engraved letters, proof that his grandfather had been real, had worked here, had hung his clothes in this locker and eaten his lunch and washed the soot from his hands at the end of each shift. The other 2 nameplates read C. Washington and J. Dorsey, the 3 black welders who had built Liberty ships and been erased from history. Their lockers stood together in the corner, separated from the others by intention or circumstance or both. Will felt something break loose inside him, some dam he had been holding against a flood he had carried for too long. He leaned forward, pressed his forehead against the cold metal of his grandfather's locker, and for the first time in 5 years, since the day his ex-wife had walked out and his son had stopped returning his calls, William Hayes let himself cry. The tears came hard and silent, his shoulders shaking, one hand gripping the locker door to keep himself upright. He cried for his grandfather who had died in poverty, working as a janitor in the same town where he had once been one of the best welders on the coast. He cried for his father who had spent his whole life trying to prove a truth nobody wanted to hear. He cried for himself, for the years he had wasted being angry at Marcus for not understanding, when maybe he had never given the boy a reason to understand anything except his father's obsession with a past that could not be proven. When the tears finally stopped, Will straightened up and wiped his face with his sleeve. The building seemed quieter now, as if it had been waiting for this, for someone to come and acknowledge what had happened here. He spent the next hour exploring the rest of the ground floor, cataloging in his mind what remained and what was too far gone to salvage. The overhead crane system was intact, but the motors were seized. The ventilation ductwork hung in tatters. The electrical system had been stripped for copper years ago. The office area in the back corner had collapsed entirely, leaving a pile of rotted wood and broken furniture. But the bones of the building were still good. The main support columns showed no signs of serious corrosion. The floor, under decades of grime, was solid concrete without major cracks. The wall structure was sound, even if the roof needed complete replacement. A man with time and skill and enough money could bring this place back from the edge. Will did not have the money, he barely had the time, but skill he had plenty of. It was on his second circuit of the building, when the afternoon light had shifted and the shadows lay different across the floor, that he noticed something odd. Near the center of the space, a section of floor about 10 feet square was made of steel plate instead of concrete. It sat flush with the surrounding surface, but the material was clearly different, and around the edges, if he looked closely, he could see weld seams. Will knelt beside it, running his fingers along the joints. The welds were old but beautifully done, each bead laid with the kind of precision that came from decades of practice. They had not been made to repair a crack or patch a hole. They had been made to seal something in, or seal something shut. He went to his truck and came back with his toolbox, pulled out a tape measure and marked the dimensions. 10 feet by 10 feet exactly. He tapped the steel with a wrench and heard the hollow ring of empty space beneath. His pulse quickened. The county records had mentioned nothing about a basement or cellar. The building plans he had requested showed only the ground floor and the upper gallery where foremen had once watched over the work. But someone had gone to considerable effort to cut a hole in this floor and seal it with steel plate, using welds that would last longer than the building itself. Will went back to the truck and returned with an angle grinder and a fresh cutting wheel. The tools screamed to life, throwing sparks that danced across the dim floor as he began cutting through the welds. The work went slowly. Whoever had sealed this had used quarter-inch plate and had overlapped the seams for strength. It took him 40 minutes to cut around 3 sides, stopping twice to change wheels when they burned out. Finally, he shut off the grinder and set it aside. The steel plate shifted slightly when he stepped on it, no longer held firm. He found a pry bar in his truck and worked it under the edge, levering upward. The plate resisted, then suddenly gave way with a shriek of tortured metal, pivoting up on the 4th side like a massive trapdoor. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying the smell of earth and rust and something else, something like machine oil and old paper. Will aimed his flashlight into the opening. A steel staircase descended into darkness, each step riveted to a central spine, the handrail made of pipe with welded joints every 3 feet. The craftsmanship was identical to the welds on the floor plate. Whoever had built this had been a master of the trade. Will tested the first step with his weight. It held solid. He started down. 12 steps brought him to a floor of poured concrete. The flashlight beam swung across a space about 15 feet wide and 20 feet long, the ceiling 8 feet overhead. The walls were not concrete or wood but steel plate, formed and riveted together in overlapping sections. It took him a moment to recognize what he was looking at. This was not a basement or a storage cellar. This was a mock ship hull compartment, built to the exact specifications of a Liberty ship's interior. A training space where new welders could practice their trade before being let loose on actual vessels. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. Along the walls stood steel shelving units, many of them rusted but still intact. Will moved closer with the flashlight, illuminating what remained on the shelves. Training manuals in cracked leather bindings, their spines stamped with dates from 1942 and 1943. Technical drawings on yellowed paper, showing cross-sections of ship hulls and weld patterns and stress calculations. A stack of propaganda posters, the colors still vivid behind dust, showing Rosie the riveter with her bandana and her flexed arm, exhorting women to join the workforce. On a workbench against the far wall, tools lay arranged with careful precision, as if their owner had just stepped away and would return any moment. A ball-peen hammer, a selection of chisels, a set of calipers, each one showing the wear patterns of long use, the handles shaped by the grip of human hands. Will stood in the center of the underground room and slowly turned in a circle, his light catching on details he had not noticed at first. Stenciled numbers on the wall plates, matching the numbering system used in ship hulls. A painted safety line on the floor, showing where the bulkhead would be. A set of hooks welded to the ceiling where practice pieces could be hung for overhead welding. Someone had built this with love and purpose. Someone had wanted to train welders properly, to give them a space where they could learn the craft before their mistakes could cost lives at sea. We'll move to a corner where wooden crates were stacked 3 high. The top crate bore a stencil mark in faded black paint. Confidential, Bureau of Ships 1943. His hands trembled slightly as he worked the crowbar under the lid. The nails shrieked coming out of wood that had gone soft with age. The lid came free and Will set it aside, shining his light into the crate. Photographs, hundreds of them stacked in neat rows, each one a black and white window into the past. Will lifted the first stack out carefully, supporting the brittle paper with both hands. He carried them to the workbench and spread them out in the pool of his flashlight. Men stared back at him from across 8 decades. Young men, mostly, though some showed the gray hair and weathered faces of those who had come to the shipyards with years of experience already behind them. They stood in groups of 6 or 8 or 10, arranged in front of ships in various stages of construction, or gathered around welding stations, or posed with tools in hand. The photographs were professional, taken by someone who knew how to compose an image. In each one, the men stood proud, shoulders back, faces serious or smiling, depending on the moment. These were the official photographs, the ones meant for the newspapers and the government reports and the company records. And in every single photograph, the workers were white. We'll set these aside and reached for another stack. These photographs were different, smaller, less formal, the kind of pictures men took of each other during breaks, using personal cameras loaded with whatever film they could afford. In these images, the story changed. A group of 10 men stood beside a completed hull section, and 3 of them were black. A welding crew gathered around a joint they had just finished, 8 faces behind their raised masks, and 2 of those faces were dark-skinned. A lunch break scene showed 15 workers sitting on steel beams, eating from metal lunch pails, and scattered among them were the men who had been carefully excluded from the official record. Will sorted through the stack with growing urgency, his hands moving faster now, looking for something he knew had to be there, some confirmation of what his father had told him, what his heart had always insisted was true. And then he found it. A photograph of 3 men standing in front of a ship so large it filled the frame behind them, the bow rising up like a wall of steel. The men wore welding leathers and held their masks in their hands, faces visible, expressions caught somewhere between exhaustion and pride. The light was late afternoon, long shadows stretching across the deck behind them. The man in the center was young and strong, broad through the shoulders, his work shirt rolled to the elbows showing forearms thick with muscle. His face was open and honest, eyes looking directly at the camera without hesitation or apology. Will knew that face. He had carried a copy of it in his wallet for 20 years. Emmett Hayes, his grandfather, standing tall in 1944, one of the men who built the ships that won the war. Will sat down hard on the floor, his back against the steel wall, and held the photograph up to the light. His vision blurred, but he did not let himself look away. He stared at his grandfather's face until he had memorized every detail, the way the light caught on his cheekbone, the set of his jaw, the confidence in his stance. "You were real," he whispered to the silence. "You were here." He turned the photograph over. On the back, in careful handwriting that had faded to brown, someone had written a caption. Emmett Hayes, first-class welder. Joseph Brennan, foreman. Charles Washington, fitter. Liberty Ship Construction, Brennan Shipyard, September 1944. We'll read the words 3 times, his fingers tracing the letters as if touch could somehow reach back through the decades and connect him to the hand that had written them. He set the photograph aside with a care approaching reverence and reached into the crate again. More pictures followed, and in many of them he saw his grandfather's face, working, laughing, standing with other men, white and black together, united by the common cause of building ships faster than the enemy could sink them. But as he sorted through the images, Will began to notice a pattern. The official photographs, the ones with professional stamps and dates on the back, showed only white workers. The personal photographs, the ones without official markings, showed the truth. The same jobs, the same ships, but with all the faces included. Someone had deliberately split the historical record into 2 versions, the official lie and the unofficial truth. At the bottom of the crate, Will found a manila envelope, larger than the photographs, sealed with tape that had long since lost its adhesive properties. He opened it carefully and slid out the contents. 2 documents, both typed on official letterhead. The first was dated April 1946 and came from the Bureau of Ships, Department of the Navy. We'll read it slowly, his jaw tightening with each line. To Joseph Brennan, Foreman, Brennan Shipyard. From Bureau of Ships Personnel Division. RE. Documentation Standards for Historical Archive. Per directive from the Office of the Secretary, all documentation crediting Negro workers in the Liberty Ship Construction Program must be amended to conform to updated standards. Official records will reflect white supervisory personnel only. Photographs submitted for National Archive must comply with this directive. Any documentation not in compliance is to be destroyed immediately. This includes but is not limited to personnel records, photographic evidence, and commendation files. Failure to comply will result in termination of future government contracts. We'll read the letter twice, then a third time, each word landing like a hammer blow. They had not just ignored the black workers. They had systematically erased them, with official orders and bureaucratic language, and the threat of economic ruin for anyone who refused to comply. The second document was a handwritten letter on the same official paper, the writing cramped and angular, as if the pen had been pressed hard against the page. I received your directive regarding personnel documentation. I understand the order. I will not comply. The men who worked in this shipyard, regardless of the color of their skin, built ships that saved American lives. Emmett Hayes welded seams that held together under fire in the North Atlantic. Charles Washington fitted hull plates that kept water out while U-boats hunted above. James Dorsey worked longer hours than any white man I supervised and never once complained. I will not destroy proof of their work. I will not participate in this lie. History will judge us for what we do here. When that judgment comes, I want to be on the side of truth. I am sealing these documents and photographs in a place where they will be safe. Someday, someone honest enough will find them. Someone who cares more about truth than convenience. When that person comes, they will know what was done here. They will know who built these ships, and they will know that I tried in my own way to make it right. The letter was unsigned, but at the bottom in the same hand was written a single line. For whoever finds this, tell their story. Will sat in the underground chamber with the letter in his hands, surrounded by 8 decades of silence, and felt the full weight of what he had inherited. This was not just a building. It was a tomb for hidden truth, a vault where one man had tried to preserve what the government had ordered destroyed. Joseph Brennan had risked everything to protect the legacy of men like Emmett Hayes, and now, 80 years later, Will held the proof in his hands. He gathered the photographs carefully, placed them back in the crate along with the letters, and carried everything up the steel stairs into the fading afternoon light. The shipyard felt different now, less like a ruin and more like a cathedral, a place where something sacred had been preserved against all odds. Will loaded the crate into his truck and stood for a long time looking at the building, at the rusted walls and the broken windows and the roof that barely held together. Everyone in town thought he was crazy for buying this place. His ex-wife had said as much in the divorce papers. His son Marcus had made it clear he thought his father was chasing ghosts instead of living in reality. But Will was not chasing ghosts anymore. He was standing on holy ground, in a place where his grandfather had worked and bled and built things that mattered. He was holding proof that Emmett Hayes had been real, had been skilled, had been part of something larger than himself. And he was holding a responsibility that Joseph Brennan had carried alone for too many years. The letter's final line echoed in his mind, "Tell their story." Will climbed into his truck, started the engine, and looked once more at the photograph of his grandfather on the seat beside him. The young man in the picture stared back with steady eyes, a man who had known his worth even when the world refused to acknowledge it. "I will tell it, Grandpa," Will said quietly. "I do not know how yet, but I will tell it." The sun was setting over the Columbia River as he drove away from the shipyard, the sky turning the color of forge fire, orange and red and gold. Behind him, the building stood dark against the light, keeping its secrets a little while longer, waiting for the next chapter of its story to unfold. Will did not know that in 3 days, Marcus would show up at his door for the first time in 3 years, wearing a suit and carrying papers that would change everything. He did not know that the building was already marked for destruction by people who had every reason to want the past to stay buried. He did not know that the real fight was just beginning. All he knew, driving through the November dusk with his grandfather's photograph on the seat beside him, and proof of truth locked in a crate in his truck bed, was that he had finally found what he had been searching for his entire life. Not just evidence of his grandfather's existence, but a purpose, a reason, a legacy that demanded to be honored. The last riveter had been found, and his story, buried for 80 years beneath steel and lies, was about to come to light. The crate sat on Will's kitchen table for 3 days before he could bring himself to open it again. He circled it the way a man circles a wound he is not ready to examine, knowing that once he looks directly at it, everything changes. The photographs and letters inside represented more than historical evidence. They were a doorway into a past that would demand something from him, some action he was not sure he had the strength to take. His apartment was a single room above a marine supply store on Commercial Street, the kind of place that smelled permanently of coffee and diesel fuel no matter how many times he cleaned. The walls were thin enough that he could hear the couple next door arguing most nights, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm he had learned to sleep through. A hot plate, a mini fridge, a mattress on the floor. Everything he owned fit in 2 duffel bags and a toolbox. This was what his life had become after the divorce, after the accident, after Marcus stopped calling. A series of small rooms and smaller choices, each one another step away from the man he had imagined he would be. But the crate on his table represented something different. It was proof that his grandfather had been real, had mattered, had built things that saved lives while the government was busy pretending he did not exist. And if Emmett Hayes could do that, could work with dignity while the world conspired to make him invisible, then maybe Will could find the courage to do something more than just exist in this small room waiting for his back to hurt less and his phone to ring. On the 4th morning, he made coffee on the hot plate and sat down at the table. The crate opened with the same reluctant creak as before. Will lifted out the photographs one by one, arranging them across the scarred wooden surface in chronological order based on the dates written on the backs. January 1943. His grandfather standing with a crew of 8 men in front of a ship hull so massive it seemed to fill the sky behind them. Emmett looked young here, not yet 25, his face unlined, his shoulders broad with the kind of strength that came from years of physical work. March 1943. A welding station mid-shift, 3 men bent over a seam, their torches throwing sparks that the camera had frozen into trails of light. Emmett was the man on the left, his body language focused, professional, the stance of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. June 1943. A group photo on launch day, 30 workers gathered around the bow of a completed Liberty ship, the vessel fresh painted and ready for the ocean. Emmett stood in the back row, partially hidden behind taller men, but his face was visible if you knew to look for it. Someone had tried to crop him out of the official version. Will had both copies now, could see exactly where the scissors had been meant to cut. He worked through the stack methodically, creating a timeline of his grandfather's war work. By noon, he had sorted 67 photographs that included Emmett Hayes, each one a fragment of a story that had never been told. Together, they painted a picture of a man who had shown up every day and done work that mattered, who had stood shoulder to shoulder with white workers and proved himself their equal, who had helped build a fleet that carried armies across the Atlantic. And every official record said he had never been there at all. Will set the photographs aside and picked up the leather-bound logbook he had found beneath them. The cover was embossed with initials, JAB, and a date, 1942. Inside, the handwriting was precise and angular, the work of someone accustomed to keeping detailed records. He turned to the first entry and began to read. January 15, 1942. Received confirmation of Navy contract, 20 Liberty ships over 18 months, the largest order this yard has ever seen. Hiring begins Monday. We will need every skilled welder on the coast. Will flipped forward, scanning entries that detailed the frantic buildup of the shipyard, the installation of new equipment, the training of workers who had never set foot in a shipyard before the war. Joseph Brennan's voice came through clearly on the page, a mixture of pride and anxiety, a man who understood the magnitude of what was being asked and was determined not to fail. March 3, 1942. Hired 3 Negro welders today. Hayes, Washington, and Dorsey. All came with references from Portland yards. Hayes in particular shows exceptional skill. His vertical welds are cleaner than anything I have seen from men with twice his experience. Will stopped reading and put his finger on the page marking the spot. His grandfather had been exceptional, not just good, not just adequate, exceptional, and someone had noticed. Someone had written it down. He kept reading. April 12, 1942. Navy inspector questioned the presence of Negro workers, suggested they be assigned to less critical tasks. I informed him that my best welder happens to be colored, and I would not reassign him to make the inspector more comfortable. Inspector left without approving this month's progress report. We'll likely hear about this from headquarters. May 2, 1942. Received letter from Bureau of Ships. Strongly worded suggestion that workforce composition should reflect appropriate standards. I read this to mean they want the Negro workers gone or hidden. I will do neither. The ships we are building will carry soldiers to war. Those men deserve the best welders we have, regardless of what color skin those welders were born with. Will felt something tighten in his chest. Joseph Brennan had fought for his grandfather, had put his own position at risk to keep Emmett Hayes and the others on the line. This was not just a story about racism. It was a story about a man who had chosen to do the right thing when doing the wrong thing would have been easier and safer and more profitable. The entries continued through 1943 and into 1944, documenting the steady production of ships, the occasional accidents, the small victories and larger frustrations of wartime manufacturing. But woven through it all was Joseph's growing anger at the pressure he was receiving from Navy bureaucrats. September 18, 1943. Another photographer from the Bureau wanted official pictures for the National Archive. I made sure Hayes, Washington, and Dorsey were in every shot. Photographer took the pictures but suggested it might be better if the colored workers were not so prominent. I suggested he do his job and let me do mine. November 4, 1943. Received prints from the September photo session. Every image has been cropped or edited to remove the Negro workers. It is as if they were never here. I have the original negatives. I will keep them safe. January 19, 1944. Hayes welded the keel section of hull number 14 in record time. Seam passed X-ray inspection without a single flaw. I submitted his name for commendation. Request was denied without explanation. We'll read through 1944 and into 1945, watching Joseph's frustration build with each entry, each rejection, each attempt to erase the contributions of men who were doing the same work as everyone else and often doing it better. By the time the entries reached the end of the war, Joseph's handwriting had changed, the letters sharper, the words more terse. August 15, 1945. War is over. We built 19 Liberty ships, lost one worker to an accident, launched vessels that carried thousands of soldiers and millions of tons of supplies. The Navy sent a letter of commendation for the yard. It lists me and 5 white foremen by name. Hayes, Washington, and Dorsey are not mentioned. It is as if they never existed. The entries became less frequent after the war. Joseph wrote about the slowdown in production, the layoffs, the struggle to keep the yard profitable when the government contracts dried up. But he also wrote about what happened to the black workers. October 3, 1945. Hayes came to my office today asking for a reference letter. He is applying for work at the Portland yards. I wrote the best letter I have ever written, detailed his skills and his work ethic and his contributions to the war effort. He thanked me and left. I wonder if it will be enough. December 12, 1945. Ran into Hayes at the hardware store. He has not found work. Every yard he applies to tells him they have no record of his previous employment. The references I wrote might as well be fiction. The government has erased him so thoroughly that he cannot even prove he knows how to weld. Will had to stop reading. He stood up from the table and walked to the window, looking down at the street below where rain was starting to fall. His grandfather had helped win the war and then come home to find that the country he had served had made him unemployable. The skills that had been essential in wartime were suddenly worthless in peace, not because he had lost them, but because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging that a black man had been good at something that mattered. He forced himself to sit back down and finish the logbook. The final entries were sparse, sometimes months apart. March 8, 1946. Hayes stopped by the yard. He has taken work as a janitor at the high school, 50 cents an hour. This is what we do to men who saved lives with their skill. We give them a mop and tell them to be grateful. June 22, 1946. Received official directive from Bureau of Ships. All records mentioning Negro workers must be amended or destroyed. I am given 60 days to comply. I will not comply. I am building a sealed room beneath the workshop floor. What I cannot preserve in the official record, I will preserve in secret. Let them erase the paperwork. They will not erase the truth. November 9, 1978. Final entry. I am 81 years old and the yard is closing. The work is gone. The ships are gone. Most of the men who built them are gone. But the room beneath the floor holds the proof of what they did. I am sealing it tonight. Someday someone will find it, someone who cares more about truth than comfort. Someone who will tell the story I could not make the world hear. To whoever finds this, Hayes and Washington and Dorsey were real. They were skilled. They mattered. Do not let them be forgotten again. Will closed the logbook and sat in silence, listening to the rain against the window and the distant sound of ships on the river. He felt the weight of Joseph Brennan's final request settling onto his shoulders like a physical thing. Tell the story. Do not let them be forgotten. But how did you tell a story like this? Who would listen? Who would care that 80 years ago, 3 black men had built ships and been written out of history? The world had moved on. The war was ancient history. The men who had benefited from the erasure were dead. The men who had been erased were dead. What good did it do to dig up old injustices now? His phone rang, the sound harsh in the quiet room. Will looked at the screen and felt his stomach tighten. Marcus. His son's name glowing on the display, the first call in 3 years. He let it ring 4 times before answering. Dad. The voice on the other end was careful, controlled. the tone Marcus used when he was trying not to let emotion show through. Will recognized it because he had taught his son to talk that way, had modeled that same careful restraint his whole life. Marcus Will said, "I heard you bought the old shipyard, the Brennan place. News travels fast. It is a small town, Dad, people talk." Will waited, not sure what he was supposed to say. The silence stretched between them, 3 years of it, heavy as anchor chain. "I need to talk to you," Marcus said finally. "Can I come by?" "When?" "Tonight I am in town for work. I could be there in an hour." Will looked around his small apartment, at the crate on the table, at the photographs spread across every surface, at the evidence of his obsession with a grandfather Marcus had never believed was real. "All right," he said, "you know where I live." "Above the marine supply store, I know." The call ended. Will sat holding the phone, trying to remember the last time he had seen his son's face. 3 years ago. Thanksgiving dinner at a restaurant neither of them had wanted to be in, both of them going through the motions because Will's ex-wife had insisted, because she had not yet given up on the idea that they could still be a family if everyone just tried hard enough. It had not worked. Marcus had brought up the shipyard research, had asked why Will could not just let the past go and focus on the present. Will had tried to explain about legacy, about history, about the importance of truth. Marcus had said something about living in reality instead of chasing ghosts, and Will had said something he could not quite remember now but knew had been cruel. And then Marcus had stood up and walked out, and neither of them had called the other since. Will gathered the photographs carefully and put them back in the crate. He made the bed, though it was just a mattress on the floor. He washed the 2 coffee mugs in the sink and set them on the dish rack to dry. He tried to make the small room look like something other than what it was, the residence of a man who had given up on everything except proving that his grandfather had existed. The knock came exactly an hour later. Will opened the door and there was Marcus, 28 years old and looking like a stranger. The boy Will remembered had been lean and uncertain, still growing into himself. The man standing in the hallway wore a tailored suit and carried a leather briefcase and had the kind of confidence that came from success in the world. Marcus Will said, "Dad." They stood looking at each other for a moment, neither quite sure how to bridge the gap. Then Marcus stepped inside and Will closed the door behind him. The apartment looked smaller with another person in it. Marcus glanced around, taking in the single room, the hot plate, the mattress on the floor. Will saw him notice the crate on the table and watched something change in his son's expression. Still chasing it, Marcus said quietly, "I found it." Marcus turned to look at him. "Found what?" "Proof." Will moved to the table and opened the crate. "Your great-grandfather Emmett Hayes worked at Brennan Shipyard during World War II. He welded Liberty ships. He was one of the best welders they had, and the government erased him from every official record because he was black." He pulled out the photographs and spread them across the table. Marcus did not move closer. "Dad, please. Look at them." "I do not need to look at them. I know what this is. It is the same thing it has always been. You have found some old pictures and convinced yourself they prove something that is not there." Will picked up the photograph of his grandfather standing in front of the ship hull. He held it out to Marcus. "This is him. This is Emmett Hayes, your great-grandfather. He was 26 years old in this picture. He had just welded the keel section of a Liberty ship in record time." Marcus did not take the photograph. "That could be anyone, Dad. You want it to be him so badly that you see what you want to see." Will felt anger rising in his chest, hot and familiar. He set the photograph down and picked up Joseph Brennan's logbook instead. "Then explain this." Will open to a random page and read aloud. Hayes welded the keel section of hull number 14 in record time. Seam passed X-ray inspection without a single flaw. I submitted his name for commendation. Request was denied without explanation. He looked up at Marcus. Joseph Brennan kept detailed records. He wrote about my grandfather by name. He documented his work. He tried to get him recognized and the Navy refused. And when the war ended, they ordered him to destroy all evidence that Emmett Hayes had ever worked there. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer but no less certain. I am not here to argue about this, Dad. I am here because I need to tell you something. Something you are not going to want to hear. We'll set the logbook down. What? I work for Tidewater Development now. Real estate acquisition. It is a good job. I am good at it. The words hit Will like cold water. Tidewater. The company that had been buying up waterfront property all along the Columbia, tearing down old buildings and putting up condominiums and retail spaces for people who wanted to live near the river but not smell it. You quit engineering, Will said. I changed careers, yes, 2 years ago. You were going to build bridges. I was going to be in debt for another decade trying to make partner at a firm that did not value my work. Marcus's voice had an edge now. Real estate pays better, and I am good at it. You would know that if you had ever asked. Will said nothing. He had not asked, had not called, had let the silence stretch into years because it was easier than admitting he had said things he could not take back. Tidewater sent me here, Marcus said. The company wants to buy the shipyard property. They are prepared to make you an offer. Will felt the floor shift beneath him. You are here on business. I am here because my boss asked me to make contact with the new owner. I did not know it was you until this morning when I saw the deed transfer records. Get out. Dad, listen to me. Get out of my house. Marcus did not move. You paid $8,000 for a building that is going to collapse within a year. The roof is failing. The foundation is compromised. You cannot afford to repair it, and you do not have the money to maintain it. Tidewater is willing to offer you $150,000 cash for the property. 30-day close. You could take that money and actually have a life instead of living like this. He gestured at the small room, at the mattress on the floor, at everything Will's life had become. Like what? Will asked quietly. Like a man who has given up everything to chase ghosts. The words landed exactly where Marcus had aimed them. Will felt them hit, felt the truth in them, felt the weight of his son's disappointment and anger, and 3 years of silence crystallizing into this moment. I found him, Will said. Your great-grandfather. He was real. He mattered. And I am not selling the place where he worked to some company that wants to put condos over his grave. Marcus picked up his briefcase. Then you are going to lose it anyway. Tidewater is filing a zoning challenge. The property sits in an area that was just rezoned residential. Industrial structures are not permitted. You will either sell or they will take it through eminent domain and you will get nothing. Will stared at his son, at this man in an expensive suit, who had just threatened him on behalf of the people trying to erase the last proof of his grandfather's existence. Is that why you came here? Will asked, to threaten me. I came here to give you a chance to make a smart decision for once in your life. Marcus's voice cracked slightly on the last words. But I should have known better. You would rather die alone in this place holding onto the past than take a step forward into the present. He walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the knob. They were never going to let you keep it, Dad. The building is condemned. One more winter storm and it comes down on its own. You are fighting for something that is already gone. Marcus opened the door and stepped into the hallway. He paused and looked back. I will be at the Cannery Hotel if you change your mind. The offer is good for 10 days. Then he was gone, and Will was alone again in the small room with the rain falling harder now, and the photographs of his grandfather spread across the table like evidence in a trial that would never be held. Will sat down heavily, his back screaming from the sudden movement. He looked at the crate, at the logbook, at Joseph Brennan's final entry begging someone to tell the story. He thought about Marcus in his expensive suit, working for the people who wanted to bury this history one more time. And he thought about his grandfather, 26 years old and skilled beyond measure, coming home from the war to find that the country he had helped save did not want to admit he existed. The anger that rose in Will now was different from what he had felt before. It was not the hot flash of temper that had driven Marcus away 3 years ago. It was something colder and harder, forged from the understanding that this was not just about him and his obsession with the past. This was about whether the truth mattered, about whether men like Emmett Hayes deserved to have their stories told, about whether the systems that had erased them once would be allowed to erase them again. Will reached for his phone and called the one person in town who had shown him any kindness since he bought the shipyard. Grace Chen answered on the second ring. "Will, everything okay?" "No," he said. "I need help. Can you come over?" She was there in 20 minutes, shaking rain from her jacket, her eyes going immediately to the photographs on the table. "Holy hell," she breathed. "Are these from the shipyard?" Will nodded. "My grandfather is in them, Emmett Hayes. He built Liberty ships and the government pretended he never existed." Grace moved closer, looking at the images with the careful attention of someone who understood she was seeing something important. She picked up the photo of Emmett in front of the hull and studied it for a long moment. "He looks like you," she said quietly. Will had not seen it before, but now that she said it, he could. The set of the shoulders, the way his grandfather stood with his weight slightly forward, ready to work, the expression that was serious but not hard, a man who knew his value even when others denied it. "My son was just here," Will said. "He works for the company that wants to buy the property and tear down the building. They are going to try to take it from me." Grace set the photo down carefully. "Then we need to make sure people know what is there before they do." "Hello?" She pulled out her phone. "I know someone at the Astoria Gazette. Young reporter, black woman, good writer. She has been looking for stories about the city's hidden history. This is exactly what she needs." Will hesitated. "If we go public with this, it becomes real. Tidewater will fight harder. My son will." Grace met his eyes. "If you do not go public with this, it stays buried forever. Is that what you want?" Will looked at his grandfather's face in the photograph, at Joseph Brennan's logbook with its plea to tell the story, at the evidence of truth that had waited 80 years in darkness for someone to bring it into the light. "No," he said, "call her." Grace made the call. The reporter's name was Janelle Morrison, and she could meet them at the shipyard tomorrow morning at 8. She wanted to see everything, photograph everything, hear the whole story. After Grace left, Will sat alone with the photographs and tried to imagine what would happen next. He thought about Marcus at the Cannery Hotel, probably reporting back to his bosses that the old man would not sell. He thought about Tidewater Development preparing their legal challenge. He thought about the building itself, waiting in the rain with its secrets exposed and its future uncertain. But mostly he thought about his grandfather, welding seams that would hold through Atlantic storms, building ships that saved lives, doing work that mattered while the world conspired to pretend he was not there. If Emmett Hayes could do that, Will thought, then surely his grandson could find the courage to fight for the truth, even if the fight meant losing everything else. He pulled out the photograph of his grandfather one more time and studied it in the dim light of his small apartment. Somewhere in the city, Marcus was probably angry at him. Somewhere in an office, lawyers were probably drafting documents to take the shipyard away. Somewhere in the rain, the building itself was slowly dying, held together by rust and stubbornness and the ghost of better days. But tomorrow morning, a reporter would come, and the story that had been buried for 80 years would begin to emerge. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Will placed the photograph gently back in the crate and closed the lid. His back ached and his hands were tired, and his son hated him, and he had probably just made the biggest mistake of his life by refusing $150,000. But for the first time in 3 years, William Hayes felt like he was doing something that mattered. The rain continued falling as he turned off the lights and lay down on his mattress. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles. Tonight, he would sleep with the knowledge that he had chosen truth over convenience, legacy over profit, his grandfather's honor over his own comfort. It would have to be enough. Janelle Morrison arrived at the shipyard at 7:45, 15 minutes early, driving a 10-year-old Honda with a press credential hanging from the rearview mirror. She was 32 years old with natural hair pulled back in a bun and eyes that missed nothing. Will watched her from the doorway as he stood waiting, leaning against the frame to take weight off his back, wondering if he was about to make everything worse or finally start making things right. Grace had vouched for her. Said Janelle had done a piece last year about redlining in Astoria during the 50s, had dug through county records nobody else bothered to read, had made the city council uncomfortable enough that they passed a formal resolution acknowledging past discrimination. That kind of reporter was either going to understand what Will had found, or she was going to think he was just another old man with a conspiracy theory and a pile of old photographs. Janelle climbed out of her car carrying a camera bag and a digital recorder. She wore jeans and a rain jacket, practical clothes for crawling around an abandoned building, and when she shook, Will's hand her grip was firm and direct. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "thank you for calling me." "Call me Will, and I should be thanking you. I know this is probably not the kind of story that sells papers." She smiled slightly at that, adjusting the camera bag on her shoulder. "You would be surprised what people want to read about when you give them something real. Grace said you found evidence of black shipyard workers during World War II, workers who were written out of the historical record." "My grandfather," Will said, "Emmett Hayes. He was a welder here from 1942 to 1945, built Liberty ships. The government erased him from every official document because of the color of his skin." Janelle's expression shifted, the professional mask giving way to something more personal. "My great-uncle worked in the Portland shipyards during the war. Family always said he helped build destroyers. We never found any proof either." Will nodded toward the building. "I have proof. More than I know what to do with. Come on, I will show you." He led her inside, watching her reaction as the scale of the space revealed itself. She stopped just past the threshold, the same way he had stopped his first time, taking in the cathedral dimensions of the place, the overhead cranes, the welding stations lined up like altars. "My God," she said quietly, "this is massive." They built ships here that carried armies across the Atlantic. Will's voice echoed in the empty space. 20 Liberty ships in 3 years, launched one every 6 weeks at the height of production. My grandfather welded the keel sections, the most critical welds on the entire vessel. He showed her the wall of lockers first, let her see the nameplate with E. Hayes engraved in brass. She photographed it from 3 angles, the flash throwing harsh shadows across the corroded metal. Then he took her to the steel plate in the floor and she helped him pry it open, both of them straining against the weight until it finally pivoted up with a groan of protesting metal. The stairs led down into darkness. Will went first with a flashlight, his boots ringing on steel, Janelle following close behind. When they reached the bottom and he swept the light across the underground chamber, he heard her breath catch. "This is not just a storage space," she said. Will explained what he had figured out, that this was a training compartment built to ship hull specifications, that Joseph Brennan had constructed it to preserve evidence the government wanted destroyed. Janelle moved through the space methodically, photographing everything, the riveted walls, the workbench with its ancient tools, the shelves still holding training manuals from 1943. He showed her the crate with the photographs and watched her face as she went through them one by one, seeing the same pattern he had seen, the official images with only white faces and the personal photographs that showed the truth. She set them out on the workbench in 2 rows, the lies on one side and the truth on the other, and photographed the contrast. Then he showed her Joseph Brennan's logbook. Janelle read for 20 minutes without speaking, turning pages carefully, her expression growing tighter with each entry. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. "He fought for them," she said. "This foreman. He knew what was happening and he fought back the only way he could." Will nodded. His name was Joseph Brennan, Irish immigrant, ran this yard for 40 years. The last entry in that book is from 1978. He was 81 years old and he was still trying to make sure the truth survived. Janelle wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, not bothering to hide it. "This is not a local interest story, Will. This is national. This is Smithsonian level. Do you understand what you have here?" "I understand that my son works for the company trying to take this building away from me. I understand that I have maybe 10 days before they file legal action. I understand that once this place is gone, all of this goes with it. Then we need to move fast." Janelle pulled out her phone. "I am going to call my editor right now. We are running this story tomorrow, front page, and I am going to make some calls to people I know at the Oregonian and the Seattle Times. This needs to be bigger than Astoria." Will felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten it was there. Someone believed him. Someone understood. They spent the next 3 hours going through everything. Janelle recorded an interview with Will, asking him to tell his grandfather's story, to explain what it had meant to grow up knowing Emmett Hayes had existed, but having no way to prove it. She photographed every document, every photograph, Joseph Brennan's logbook page by page. She took video of the underground chamber, panning slowly across the riveted walls, the training equipment, the shelves that held the fragments of a deliberately buried past. By the time they climbed back up to ground level, the morning had turned to afternoon, and the rain was falling steady again. Janelle stood in the main building looking around with an expression Will recognized. She was seeing ghosts now, imagining the men who had worked here, the sound of welding torches and steel being shaped, the pride and exhaustion and fear of men building weapons of war knowing their own contributions would be denied. "I need to talk to more people," she said. "Are there any other families, other workers from that time?" "Pastor Elijah Stone," Will said. "He knew my grandfather, worked with him. He is 68 now, but his memory is sharp." "Can you set up a meeting?" Will made the call right there. Elijah answered on the second ring and agreed to meet them at the church in an hour. Before they left, Janelle turned to Will with a serious expression. "You need to be ready for what happens next. Once this story breaks, you are going to get attention. Some of it good, some of it not. The company trying to buy this place is going to push back hard. And your son." She left the sentence unfinished, but Will understood. Marcus was going to feel betrayed, was going to see this as Will choosing his obsession over their relationship one more time. "I know," Will said quietly, But if I do not do this, then Emmett Hayes gets erased again, and I cannot live with that." Janelle nodded. "Then let us make sure his story gets told right." They drove separately to the church, a small white building with a steeple that had weathered 100 Oregon winters. Pastor Elijah Stone met them at the door, a tall man with gray hair and kind eyes, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of clerical robes. He shook Will's hand warmly and studied Janelle with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read people in decades of pastoral work. "You are the reporter Grace told me about," he said. "Yes, sir. Janelle Morrison with the Astoria Gazette." Come in. I made coffee. We are going to need it." They sat in the church office, a small room lined with books and photographs, and Elijah Stone told them about Emmett Hayes. His voice was deep and measured, the voice of a preacher accustomed to being heard, and as he spoke, Will felt his grandfather become real in a way he had never been before. "Emmett was the finest welder I ever knew," Elijah said, "and I knew plenty. Worked alongside him at Brennan Shipyard in 1944. I was just 18 years old, did not know which end of a torch was which, and Emmett took me under his wing. Taught me to see the metal, he used to say. Taught me to read what it needed." Janelle had her recorder running. What happened after the war? Elijah's expression darkened. Same thing that happened to every black man who had done skilled work during the war. We came home to find out the country did not need us anymore. Emmett applied to every shipyard on the coast. Portland, Seattle, San Francisco. Everywhere he went, they told him they had no record of his experience. The references Joseph Brennan wrote might as well have been fairy tales. "So what did he do?" Will asked, leaning forward. "He worked as a janitor at the high school, mopped floors for 20 years, died in 1987 without ever welding again." Elijah looked at Will. "Your father knew him better than I did toward the end. James used to visit him every Sunday. Emmett would sit in his apartment and tell stories about the ships he built, and James would write them down, trying to preserve something the world wanted to forget." Will felt his throat tighten. "I never knew that. Dad never told me." "Maybe he did not want you to carry the same weight he carried. The weight of knowing your father was great at something, and having no way to prove it." Janelle asked more questions and Elijah answered them all, giving her names of other workers who had been there, families who might still have photographs or letters, details about the working conditions and the discrimination that was casual and constant. He pulled out his own photograph from a desk drawer, a picture of 6 young men in welding leathers, and there in the center was Emmett Hayes with his arm around a teenage Elijah Stone. "You can use this," Elijah said, handing it to Janelle. "It is time these men got the recognition they earned." After the interview, Will and Janelle drove back to the shipyard. The rain had turned to mist again, softening the edges of the world, making everything feel provisional and temporary. When they pulled up to the building, there was another car parked by the fence, a black BMW with dealer plates. Will's stomach dropped. He knew that car. Marcus climbed out as they approached, his suit jacket dark with rain, his expression unreadable. He looked at Will and then at Janelle, clearly trying to figure out what was happening. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk." "This is not a good time," Will replied. "Make it a good time." Marcus glanced at Janelle. "This is a private conversation." Janelle looked at Will. "I should go anyway. I have everything I need for the story. It will run tomorrow." Marcus's expression changed. "Story? What story?" Janelle met his eyes steadily. "The story about the black shipyard workers who were erased from World War II history. Your great-grandfather Emmett Hayes among them. Front page tomorrow morning." Will watched the color drain from his son's face. Marcus turned to him. "You went to the press." "I did what I had to do." "Do you have any idea what you have just done?" Marcus's voice was rising now, the careful control slipping. Tidewater is going to bury you. They will accelerate the legal action. They will make sure you do not get a dime for this property. Then I guess I will not get a dime, Will said quietly. Janelle climbed into her car, giving them space. As she drove away, Marcus stood in the rain staring at his father with an expression that was equal parts anger and something that might have been pain. "This is what you do," Marcus said. "You choose this. Every time. You chose Grandpa Emmett over Mom. You chose him over me. And now you are choosing him over any chance you have at a decent future." Will felt the familiar anger rising but forced it down. There was something different in Marcus's voice this time, something underneath the accusation that sounded like a question he had been asking his whole life and never gotten an answer to. "Your great-grandfather built ships that saved lives," Will said slowly, "and the country he helped save turned around and told him he was not good enough to keep doing the work he was the best at. They took his skill and his pride and his future, and they erased him like he never existed. He died thinking nobody would ever know what he had done." "I know the story, Dad." "Do you? Because it seems to me you think this is about me being obsessed with the past. But it is not about the past. It is about whether we are going to keep letting the same lies win. It is about whether truth matters. Truth does not pay your rent. It does not fix your back. It does not give you your family back." "No," Will agreed. "It does not. But it gives my grandfather his name back, and maybe that has to be enough." Marcus shook his head. "Tidewater is going to move forward with the lawsuit. When they do, I am going to have to testify. They are going to ask me about the structural integrity of this building, about whether you are mentally competent to make decisions about the property, and I am going to have to tell them the truth." "Which is?" "That you are living in a fantasy, that you cannot afford to maintain this place, that you bought a condemned building because you wanted to believe in something that cannot be proven." "It can be proven." Will's voice was steady now. "I have the photographs. I have Joseph Brennan's logbook. I have testimony from men who worked with Emmett. I have everything I need to prove he was real and that he mattered." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer but no less certain. "I hope it is worth it, Dad. I really do. Because you are about to lose everything for it." He walked back to his car and drove away without looking back. Will stood in the rain watching the taillights disappear, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle onto his shoulders. He had lost his son again, maybe for good this time. But tomorrow morning the story would run, and Emmett Hayes would have his name back. That night Will could not sleep. He lay on his mattress staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain and thinking about Marcus's words. "You choose this. Every time." Maybe it was true. Maybe he had spent so long trying to prove his grandfather's existence that he had forgotten to be present for the people who were actually in his life. But what was he supposed to do? Let the truth stay buried? Let Tidewater tear down the building and pave over the last evidence that men like Emmett Hayes had built the ships that won the war? At 3 in the morning, Will gave up on sleep and went to the shipyard. He let himself in with the key he had copied, turned on the battery-powered lantern he kept in his truck, and descended once more into the underground chamber. Surrounded by the artifacts of his grandfather's life, by Joseph Brennan's careful documentation, and the photographs that proved what the official record denied, Will tried to understand what he was really fighting for. Legacy, he had told Marcus, truth, justice for men who had been wronged. But sitting alone in the darkness with only ghosts for company, Will wondered if he was also fighting for something more selfish. Proof that he came from something that mattered. Evidence that he was not just the sum of his failures, his broken back and his broken marriage and his broken relationship with his son, but part of a lineage that stretched back to men who had built things that saved lives. He pulled out the photograph of Emmett standing in front of the ship hull and studied it in the lantern light. His grandfather looked so certain in that image, so confident in his own worth. Will wanted to believe that confidence was something that could be inherited, passed down through blood and bone, but he knew better. Whatever strength Emmett Hayes had possessed, Will had not received it. He was just a tired man with a bad back, clinging to the past because the present offered nothing better. The sound of footsteps on the stairs brought his head up fast. Will grabbed the lantern and pointed it at the entrance, heart hammering, expecting to see intruders or lawyers or worse. Marcus appeared at the bottom of the stairs, soaking wet, his suit jacket gone, his white shirt plastered to his chest. He stopped when the lantern hit his face and raised one hand against the glare. "Dad," he said. Will lowered the light. "What are you doing here?" "I read it." Marcus's voice was rough. "The diary. The one you showed me. I could not sleep, so I went back to your apartment. You left the crate on the table. I read the whole thing." Will said nothing, waiting. "There is an entry," Marcus continued, stepping further into the chamber. "From 1946. Emmett writes about having a son, about naming him James, about hoping that someday his grandson would ask about him and would find." He stopped, his voice cracking. His throat worked as he struggled to continue. "Would find what he left behind, would know that he was here, that he built ships that saved lives." Marcus looked around the underground room, seeing it properly for the first time. The riveted walls, the training equipment, the shelves holding evidence of deliberate erasure. "He wrote that for you," Marcus said quietly. "Grandpa Emmett. He wrote knowing he would be dead before you were born. He wrote knowing the records would be destroyed. But he wrote it anyway because he wanted you to know." Will felt his chest constricting, something large and painful trying to force its way through. "I am sorry," Marcus said. "I am so sorry, Dad. I have been helping them try to destroy exactly what you have been protecting. I thought you were chasing ghosts, but you were right. He was real, and he mattered." Will stood slowly, his back screaming in protest, and crossed the distance between them. He pulled his son into an embrace for the first time in 3 years, both of them wet from the rain, both of them shaking. "I pushed you away," Will said into his son's shoulder, "after your mother left after the accident. I let my anger make me cruel. I am sorry." They stood like that for a long time in the underground chamber, two men trying to bridge 3 years of silence with a single moment of connection. When they finally pulled apart, Marcus wiped his eyes with his sleeve. "Tidewater is going to destroy this place if we do not stop them," Marcus said. "You know that, right?" "I know." The CEO, Richard Voss. His grandfather was Admiral Harrison Voss, Navy Department, 1945. He was the one who signed the order to erase the black workers from the records. Will stared at his son. "How do you know that?" "I did research tonight. Could not sleep after reading the diary. Admiral Voss was in charge of historical documentation for the shipbuilding program. He personally ordered Joseph Brennan to destroy the evidence. When Brennan refused, Voss made sure he never got another government contract, basically bankrupted him." "So this is not just about real estate," Will said slowly. "No, this is about Richard Voss making sure his grandfather's legacy stays clean. If your story gets out, if people learn what Admiral Voss did, it ruins the family name. Better to tear down the building and bury the evidence one more time." Marcus pulled out his phone. "I still work for Tidewater. Technically, I have access to their internal communications, and I am pretty sure what they are planning is not legal." "What are you saying?" "I am saying we fight back, you and me together." Will looked at his son's face in the lantern light and saw determination there. The same kind of stubborn refusal to quit that had driven Emmett Hayes to keep welding perfect seams, even when he knew the credit would go to someone else. "Okay," Will said, "tell me what you need." They worked through the rest of the night, Marcus on his laptop pulling files from Tidewater's servers, Will organizing the physical evidence they would need. By the time the sun came up, they had built a case that showed Richard Voss had fast-tracked the acquisition specifically to demolish the building before any historical designation could be filed. They had emails proving he knew about the artifacts in the underground chamber. They had a paper trail connecting him directly to attempts to suppress the story. At 8 in the morning, Janelle Morrison's article hit the Astoria Gazette website. By 9, it had been picked up by the Oregonian. By 10, CNN was running a segment about the forgotten black shipyard workers of World War II. By noon, the story had gone national. Will's phone rang constantly. Reporters wanting interviews. The Oregon Historical Society wanting to send a team. The Smithsonian calling to discuss artifact preservation. And through it all, Marcus stayed beside him, fielding calls, taking notes, acting as the barrier between his father and the sudden overwhelming attention. At 2 in the afternoon, a courier delivered a letter from Tidewater Development. Notice of immediate legal action to condemn the property under emergency safety provisions. They were moving faster than expected, trying to demolish the building before public pressure could stop them. Marcus read the letter and made a call. When he hung up, he looked at Will with grim satisfaction. "I just quit my job, and I just sent every file we compiled to the Attorney General's office. Tidewater is about to have much bigger problems than your building." That night, the local news ran a story showing footage of the shipyard, interviews with Pastor Elijah Stone, photographs of Emmett Hayes and Charles Washington and James Dorsey standing proud in front of the ships they had built. Will watched it in his apartment with Marcus beside him, both of them exhausted, both of them knowing the fight was far from over. But for the first time in 3 years, William Hayes was not alone. His son sat next to him, shoulder to shoulder, both of them descendants of a man who had done extraordinary work in impossible circumstances and had the grace to keep doing it even when recognition was denied. The building might still fall. Tidewater might still find a way to tear it down. Richard Voss might have enough money and power to make all of this disappear. But Emmett Hayes would not be erased again. His name was in the news now. His photograph was being shared across the country. His story was being told. And in that moment, sitting in his small apartment with his son at his side and his grandfather's legacy finally emerging from 80 years of darkness, Will understood that Joseph Brennan had been right. Truth mattered. Legacy mattered. The work of building something that would outlast you mattered. And sometimes, if you fought hard enough and refused to give up and found people willing to stand with you, the truth could win after all. Marcus looked at him. "What happens tomorrow?" Will smiled for the first time in weeks. "Tomorrow we keep fighting, just like Grandpa Emmett did." Outside, rain continued to fall on Astoria, washing the streets clean, running down to the river that had carried Liberty's ships to war 8 decades ago. The shipyard stood in the darkness, its secrets exposed now, its ghosts vindicated, its future still uncertain but no longer forgotten. And in the underground chamber beneath the floor, the photographs and documents and carefully preserved evidence waited for whatever came next, proof that some truths refused to stay buried, that some stories demanded to be told, that some legacies were stronger than the systems built to destroy them. The rain that had been falling steadily for 3 days turned violent on the 4th. It came in from the Pacific with the kind of fury that reminded people why the old-timers called this stretch of coast the the graveyard of ships, a hard driving wall of water that hammered against windows and turned streets into rivers and made the Columbia rise until it lapped at the edges of Marine Drive. Will stood at the window of his apartment watching the storm build, his phone buzzing with messages he was too tired to answer. 4 days since the story broke. 4 days of constant calls from reporters and historians, and people claiming to be relatives of other workers who had been erased. 4 days of watching his grandfather's name spread across the internet, shared and reshared until Emmett Hayes became more famous in death than he had ever been allowed to be in life. But 4 days was also how long it took Tidewater Development to move their pieces into position. The lawsuit had been filed. The emergency demolition order had been requested. And Richard Voss had made it clear through his lawyers that he intended to tear down the Brennan shipyard within the week, historical significance be damned, public outcry notwithstanding. Marcus appeared at Will's door just after dawn, soaked through despite his rain jacket, his face tight with worry. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "Tidewater filed for an emergency demolition permit last night. Judge signed it an hour ago. They are claiming the storm makes the building an imminent public safety hazard." Will felt his stomach drop. "How long do we have?" "The demolition crew is scheduled for tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. They are coming with heavy equipment and a police escort to keep protesters away." "Tomorrow," Will looked out at the rain lashing against the window. "We have to get everything out tonight." "Dad, the building is not safe in this weather. The roof is already compromised. If we go in there during the storm—" "Then we go in during the storm," Will said flatly, "because tomorrow morning there will not be anything left to save." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I will call Grace and Pastor Stone, see who else we can get." By noon they had assembled a crew of 8 volunteers. Grace Chen brought her 2 teenage sons, strong boys who played football and did not ask questions when their mother told them they were going to help save history. Pastor Elijah Stone came despite his age, bringing 2 members of his congregation who had family connections to the shipyard. A professor from the local college showed up with archival boxes and a graduate student. They met at the shipyard as the storm intensified, rain coming down so hard it was difficult to see more than 20 feet. The building looked worse than Will had ever seen it, water pouring through gaps in the roof, whole sections of corrugated steel flapping loose in the wind. Every gust made the structure groan like a dying animal. "We need to move fast," Will shouted over the noise of the storm. "Everything in the underground chamber comes out first. Photographs, documents, the logbook. Then we save what we can from up here." They worked in teams, descending into the chamber and passing items up in a chain, each person getting soaked to the skin within minutes. The photographs went into waterproof archival boxes. The logbook was wrapped in plastic and then in a blanket. The training manuals, brittle with age, were handled like sacred texts. Will worked despite his back screaming in protest, hauling boxes up the steel stairs, his hands numb with cold, his vision blurred by rain and sweat. Marcus worked beside him, the 2 of them falling into a rhythm they had never had before, father and son united by purpose for the first time in their lives. Above them, the building continued its slow death. A section of roof tore away with a sound like a gunshot, metal shrieking as it peeled back. Water cascaded through the opening, turning the floor into a shallow lake. One of the overhead cranes swayed on its rails, the ancient motors groaning, bolts working loose after decades of corrosion. "We need to get out," Grace shouted from the doorway. "This place is coming down." 5 more minutes, Will called back. Just 5 more minutes. But the building had other plans. The sound started deep in the structure, a bass rumble that Will felt in his chest before he heard it with his ears. One of the main support columns, weakened by rust and hammered by wind, began to buckle. The column was 30 feet of I-beam that had held up the northeast corner of the building for 80 years, but 80 years of exposure to salt air and rain had done their work. The metal compressed, folded, and then gave way with a crack that echoed like thunder. The roof section it had been supporting came down in a rush of twisting metal and shattering glass. 1,000 square feet of corrugated steel and wooden trusses collapsed into the space where the welding stations had stood, where Will's grandfather had worked side by side with white men doing the same job for the same purpose. "Everyone get out," Marcus screamed. "Now." The volunteers ran for the exits, splashing through ankle-deep water, Grace pushing her sons ahead of her, the professor clutching boxes against his chest. Pastor Stone moved slower, his old legs struggling with the uneven floor, and Will grabbed his arm to help him along. They made it outside just as another section of roof gave way. The sound was apocalyptic, metal screaming, wood splintering, the whole structure shuddering as if in its final throes. They stood in the rain watching the building that had held so many secrets begin to tear itself apart. "The underground chamber," Marcus said, breathing hard. "We did not get everything." We'll turn to look at the collapsing building, then at the boxes they had managed to save, stacked haphazardly in the beds of their trucks. They had maybe half of what had been down there. The rest was still sealed beneath steel and concrete, and in another few minutes it would be buried under tons of rubble. "I am going back in," Will said. "Dad, no." Marcus grabbed his arm. "You will die in there." Will pulled free. "There is a ship's bell in that chamber. Your great-grandfather welded it. Joseph Brennan saved it. If I do not get it now, it is gone forever." "Then I am going with you." Will looked at his son, at this man who had spent 3 years hating him and 4 days learning to understand him. He saw determination in Marcus's face, but he also saw fear, and that fear was not for himself. "No," Will said, "you are not, but I need you to do something for me." Marcus's jaw tightened. "What?" "If I do not come out, you make sure his story gets told. You make sure people know what he built." "Dad, promise me." Marcus's face crumpled, but he nodded. "I promise." Will turned and ran back toward the building before he could think better of it. Behind him, Marcus was shouting, but the words were lost in the roar of the storm. Will hit the doorway at a sprint, plunging back into the chaos of collapsing steel and rushing water. Inside was worse than he had imagined. The central section of the roof was gone entirely, rain falling in sheets, and debris covered the floor 3 feet deep in places. The overhead cranes had torn loose from their moorings and hung at crazy angles, chains dangling like nooses. Every few seconds, another piece of the structure would give way with a sound like a car crash. Will waded through the water and wreckage to the steel plate in the floor. It was still open, the underground chamber visible below, and by some miracle the collapse had not buried it yet. He grabbed the handrail and started down the stairs, his boots slipping on wet metal. The chamber was flooding. Water poured in through cracks in the ceiling, already 6 inches deep on the floor and rising fast. Will splashed across to the alcove where they had found the ship's bell, the small hidden space behind the workbench that Joseph Brennan had sealed with his own hands. The bell sat in a wooden cradle, brass green with age but still intact, still bearing the engraving that proved it had been part of a Liberty ship built in this yard. Will grabbed it with both hands and lifted. The bell was heavier than he expected, solid brass and iron, easily 70 pounds. His back seized immediately, pain shooting up his spine like electricity. He gritted his teeth and lifted anyway, cradling the bell against his chest. As he turned toward the stairs, his eyes caught the inscription on the cradle's brass plaque. He had seen it before but never read it carefully. Now, in the beam of his flashlight, the words stood out clearly. Hull number 14, USS John W. Brown, launched June 1943, for the men who built victory. Will felt his breath catch. Hull 14, the ship his grandfather had welded, the vessel Joseph Brennan had written about in his logbook with such pride. This bell had rung when that ship was launched, had carried across the Atlantic, had called men to their stations during the war. And Joseph Brennan had saved it, brought it back here, preserved it as proof of what had been built in this place. The water was higher now, nearly to his knees, flowing in through the ceiling cracks with increasing force. Above him, the building groaned and something massive shifted, sending a cascade of smaller debris raining down. Will made it to the stairs and started climbing, each step in agony, his arms shaking with the weight of the bell, his back threatening to give out entirely. Halfway up, his boot slipped on the wet steel and he nearly went down, catching himself on the handrail at the last second. The bell slammed against the wall with a deep musical tone that echoed through the chamber. 3 more steps, 2, 1. He emerged onto the main floor just as the far wall collapsed inward, pushed by the force of the wind and the weight of water that had been accumulating on the roof. A wave of debris swept across the floor, a churning mess of metal and wood and broken glass that would have crushed him if he had been 30 seconds slower. Will ran for the exit, or tried to. His back finally gave out completely, his legs buckling, and he went down hard onto his knees in the water. The bell slipped from his grasp and hit the concrete with a clang that somehow cut through all the other noise. He knelt there in the flood, unable to move, watching the building collapse around him. This was it, he thought. This was how it ended. Drowned in the same place his grandfather had worked, holding the last piece of evidence that Emmett Hayes had built something that mattered. Then Marcus was there, appearing out of the rain and chaos like a ghost, grabbing Will under the arms and hauling him to his feet. "I told you not to follow me," Will gasped. "When have I ever listened to you?" Marcus grabbed the bell with one hand and supported his father with the other. "Move, Dad, now." They staggered toward the exit together, Marcus half carrying Will, both of them slipping and stumbling through the ankle-deep water. Behind them the building was dying, great sections of roof and wall falling away, the skeleton of steel beams twisting and buckling. The sound was like the end of the world. They made it through the doorway and onto the gravel lot just as the main roof truss gave way. The entire central section of the building collapsed inward with a roar that shook the ground, sending up a cloud of dust and spray that mixed with the rain to create a fog that blotted out everything. Will and Marcus collapsed 20 feet from the building, both of them on their knees in the mud, gasping for breath. The bell lay between them, still intact, still bearing its inscription identifying it as part of Hull 14, the USS John W. Brown, the ship Emmett Hayes had helped build. Around them the others were running over, Grace and her sons, Pastor Stone, the professor and his student, all of them shouting questions that neither Will nor Marcus had the breath to answer. They sat in the rain watching the Brennan shipyard fold in on itself, 80 years of history compressed into rubble in the span of 5 minutes. When it was over, when the last wall had fallen and the last beam had settled, there was nothing left but a pile of twisted metal and broken concrete 3 stories high. The underground chamber was gone, buried under tons of wreckage. The training compartment where Joseph Brennan had preserved the truth was crushed flat. The wall of lockers with their brass nameplates was somewhere in that pile, unrecoverable. Everything they had not gotten out in time was lost forever. But the bell survived, and the photographs they had saved, and Joseph Brennan's logbook, and the testimony of men like Pastor Stone who had known Emmett Hayes and could swear to his existence. Will looked at Marcus, at his son's face streaked with mud and rain, and saw tears mixing with the water. "You should not have come back for me," Will said quietly. "Yes, I should have," Marcus replied. "You are my father, and I have already lost too many years with you." They helped each other stand, neither able to do it alone, both of them battered and exhausted and shaking with adrenaline. Grace wrapped emergency blankets around their shoulders. Pastor Stone said a prayer over the ruins that nobody could quite hear over the storm, but everyone understood. The professor took photographs of the collapsed building, documenting the end of something that had mattered. As they loaded the bell into the back of Will's truck, Marcus noticed something. A brass plaque attached to the base of the cradle, partially obscured by green corrosion. He scraped at it with his thumbnail until the words became visible. "Dad, look at this." Will leaned closer, squinting through the rain. The plaque was engraved with careful lettering, the kind of work someone had taken time and care to do right. To my brother in steel, it read, "You saved my life on Hull 14, the John W. Brown, when the steam line ruptured in '44. I save your legacy here. Let this bell ring for all the men they tried to forget. Joseph Brennan, 1987. We'll read it twice, then a third time, his throat closing up. His grandfather had saved Joseph Brennan's life during the war on the ship they built together, Hull 14, the USS John W. Brown, the vessel whose keel Emmett Hayes had welded in record time. The pieces fell into place. The logbook entry about Hull 14, the letter Joseph would write years later, the bond between two men, one Irish and one black, forged in the heat of wartime work and sealed by an act of courage that the Navy would never acknowledge. "Your grandfather saved Joseph Brennan's life," Marcus said softly, "during the war, on the ship they built together." Will nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The chain of legacy stretched further than he had known. Emmett had saved Joseph. Joseph had saved Emmett's memory. And now Will and Marcus were saving them both, carrying their story forward into a future neither man had lived to see. They drove away from the ruins as the storm began to ease, the rain softening to drizzle, the wind dying down. Behind them, the collapsed shipyard steamed in the cold air, a monument to both destruction and survival. Tidewater Development would get their vacant lot. Richard Voss would get to pretend the building had simply failed in a storm, that nothing of historical value had been lost. But they would be wrong. Will's apartment became a command center that evening. They spread the rescued artifacts across every surface, cataloging what they had saved. The photographs numbered in the hundreds. The training manuals had mostly survived. Joseph Brennan's logbook was intact, every page readable. And they had the bell, the physical proof that connected all the threads of the story, its plaque telling the tale of brotherhood and rescue that had never made it into official records. Janelle Morrison came by at 8, her camera ready, and they gave her everything. She photographed the bell from every angle, captured the inscription on the plaque identifying it as from Hull 14, the USS John W. Brown, recorded Marcus and Will telling the story of the rescue, and the revelation about Emmett saving Joseph's life. By midnight, her article was online with a headline that made the previous coverage look tame. "Shipyard collapses in storm, but legacy survives. The bell that wouldn't stay silent." The response was immediate and overwhelming. By morning, the story had gone viral again, bigger than before. The image of the rescued bell and its inscription about brotherhood shared across every platform. News crews descended on Astoria wanting interviews. The Smithsonian called to say they were sending a team immediately to secure the artifacts. The Oregon State Historical Society issued a statement condemning the demolition and demanding an investigation. And at 10 a.m., 3 lawyers from the state attorney general's office showed up at Will's door with a warrant for Richard Voss's arrest. The files Marcus had sent them, combined with the suspicious timing of the building collapse during a storm, had given them enough to charge Voss with destruction of historical property and conspiracy to suppress evidence. Tidewater Development's board forced Voss to resign that afternoon. The company issued a statement promising to donate the shipyard property to the state for a memorial park. And in a move nobody had expected, they offered to fund the construction of a permanent museum on the site to house the artifacts and tell the story of the workers who had been erased. Will sat in his apartment that night with Marcus beside him, both of them too exhausted to feel the full weight of what they had accomplished. The bell sat on the table between them, brass gleaming in the lamplight, still bearing the marks of the fire and water it had survived, its plaque telling the story of two brothers in steel whose bond had transcended the racism of their time. "Do you think he knew?" Marcus asked quietly. "Grandpa Emmett, do you think he knew any of this would happen?" Will thought about his grandfather welding perfect seams while the government prepared to erase his name. He thought about the faith it must have taken to keep working with skill and pride when recognition was denied. He thought about Joseph Brennan building a sealed chamber to preserve truth in darkness, trusting that someday someone would find it. "I think he hoped," Will said. "I think he did the work because it mattered, and he hoped that someday someone would know it mattered. But he could not have known it would be us." Marcus picked up the photograph of Emmett standing in front of the ship hull, the image they had found in the underground chamber 4 weeks and a lifetime ago. "We almost lost everything," he said. "If you had not bought that building, if you had not gone looking, if you had listened to me and sold to Tidewater, all of this would have stayed buried." Will put his hand on his son's shoulder. "But we did not lose it. We saved it, you and me together." They sat in comfortable silence, father and son, separated by 3 years of anger and united now by something stronger. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, and stars were beginning to appear between the clouds. Somewhere in the city, the Oregon Historical Society was preparing to receive the artifacts. Somewhere in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian was making plans for an exhibition. Somewhere across the country, people were reading about Emmett Hayes and Charles Washington and James Dorsey, learning their names for the first time, understanding that history was larger and more complex than the official records suggested. But in that small apartment above the Marine Supply Store, with the ship's bell from Hull 14 between them and the photographs spread across the table, Will and Marcus Hayes were not thinking about exhibitions or national attention or historical significance. They were thinking about a young man in welding leathers, standing proud in front of a ship he had helped build, his skill undeniable and his name about to be erased, who had done the work anyway because the work mattered. They were thinking about an Irish immigrant foreman who had risked everything to preserve truth in darkness, who had built a chamber beneath a floor and sealed evidence inside it, and trusted that someday someone honest would find it. They were thinking about legacy, about what gets passed down through generations, about what survives when everything else is stripped away. And they were thinking about each other, about the years they had lost and the bond they had found, about how sometimes the greatest discoveries are not in underground chambers or historical documents, but in the simple act of standing together when everything else is falling apart. The bell sat between them, silent now but not forever silent. Soon it would ring in a memorial park where the shipyard had stood. It would ring for Emmett Hayes and Joseph Brennan and all the men whose work had been denied. It would ring for truth that refused to stay buried and stories that demanded to be told. But tonight it rested, and Will and Marcus rested with it, 2 men who had nearly lost everything and in losing it had found what mattered most. 6 months after the storm, Will stood on the edge of what used to be the Brennan shipyard and watched construction crews pour the foundation for something new. The rubble had been cleared weeks ago, hauled away to recycling centers, where the old steel would be melted down and reborn as something else. But the land remained. 7 acres of waterfront that would never again hold ships but would hold something just as important. A memory, a truth, a reckoning. The memorial park was taking shape according to plans drawn up by an architect from Portland, who had studied photographs of the original shipyard and designed something that honored both what had been lost and what had been found. There would be a central pavilion where the main building had stood, its steel beams arranged to echo the skeleton of the original structure. There would be a museum building, smaller and modern, climate-controlled to house the artifacts that had been pulled from the underground chamber. And there would be a plaza at the water's edge where the ship's bell would hang, positioned so that anyone could ring it and send its voice across the Columbia River. But the centerpiece, the thing that made Will's throat tighten every time he saw the architectural renderings, was the wall. 40 feet long and 12 feet high, black granite polished to a mirror finish, and on that granite would be engraved the names of every worker who had built ships at Brennan Shipyard between 1942 and 1945. Not just the white workers whose names appeared in official records, all of them. Every single person who had welded steel or fitted plates or driven rivets, their names arranged alphabetically without regard to race, exactly as Joseph Brennan had always wanted. Emmett Hayes would be there, Charles Washington, James Dorsey, their names carved in stone that would outlast any paper record, any digital file, any attempt to erase them. Marcus walked up beside him, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the food truck that had set up to serve the construction workers. He handed one to Will without speaking, and they stood together watching a crane lower a massive steel beam into position. "The opening is in 2 weeks," Marcus said. "Are you ready?" Will took a sip of coffee, feeling the heat cut through the morning chill. "I have been ready for this my whole life. I just did not know it. The press is going to be there. National coverage. The Smithsonian is sending representatives. Even the Secretary of the Navy is coming to make a formal apology." Will nodded. He had been briefed on all of this, had sat through meetings with event planners and public relations specialists, and people whose job it was to manage the narrative around what had happened. It still felt surreal, the idea that his grandfather's story had become something that required management, that needed to be shaped and presented to the world. "Your speech is written?" Marcus asked. Will pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "Grace helped me with it. I am not good with words." "You found the right words when it mattered, Dad. Everything else is just details." They finished their coffee in silence, watching the construction progress. The memorial was being built with money from multiple sources. Tidewater Development had contributed $2 million as part of their settlement with the state. The Oregon Historical Society had raised another $1 million through donations. And the federal government, embarrassed by the revelation of systematic erasure of black workers during World War II, had quietly allocated $5 million from a discretionary fund. $8 million to remember men who had been paid 50 cents an hour to save the world. Will's phone buzzed. A text from Janelle Morrison reminding him about the interview scheduled for that afternoon. She was writing a book now about the Brennan Shipyard story, had already sold it to a major publisher, and wanted to do one more round of questions before she finished the manuscript. Will typed back a confirmation and pocketed the phone. "How is your new job?" he asked Marcus. Marcus smiled. "Good. Strange. I spent 3 years selling real estate, and now I am the community liaison for a historical preservation nonprofit. My old colleagues think I have lost my mind." "Have you?" "No," Marcus said quietly. "I think I finally found it." He had quit Tidewater Development the day after the storm, walked away from the salary and the benefits, and the career path he had spent years building. For a while, Will had worried that his son was sacrificing too much, throwing away his future out of guilt or some misplaced sense of obligation. But watching Marcus work over the past 6 months, coordinating with the construction crews and the historical society, and the families of other workers who were coming forward with their own stories, Will had seen something in his son that had never been there before. Purpose. The same thing Will had been searching for when he bought a condemned building with the last of his money. "They are naming the museum building after Joseph Brennan," Marcus said. "The Brennan Heritage Center. His daughter is coming from Ireland for the opening. Did you know he had a daughter?" Will shook his head. "I thought he had no heirs. That is what the county records said." Turns out he had a daughter who moved to Dublin in 1965 and lost touch with the family. Janelle tracked her down through immigration records. Her name is Siobhan. She is 78 years old, and she cried for an hour when Janelle told her what her father had done. Will thought about Joseph Brennan building the underground chamber in secret, preserving evidence that his own family never knew existed, dying alone with only the hope that someday someone would find what he had hidden. "She should be proud of him," Will said. "She is, and she is bringing something with her. Something she found in her father's papers after he died." Marcus paused. "A letter, written to you." "To me?" Will turned to look at his son. "How could he write a letter to me? He died when I was 5 years old. We never met." "It is addressed to the grandson of Emmett Hayes. Siobhan says her father wrote it in 1991, a few months before he died in 1992. She found it in a box marked to be opened only if someone ever came asking about the shipyard." Will felt his heart hammering. "Where is it now?" "Siobhan is bringing it with her. She wants to give it to you in person at the opening ceremony." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of final preparations. Will spent his days at the construction site, watching the memorial take shape, and his evenings in his apartment with the artifacts that had been temporarily loaned back to him before their permanent installation in the museum. The photographs of his grandfather were arranged on every surface. Joseph Brennan's logbook sat open on the kitchen table. And the ship's bell, cleaned and polished by professional conservators, stood in the corner waiting for the day it would be hung in its permanent home. Grace came by most evenings with dinner, refusing to let Will survive on coffee and stubbornness alone. She had become something more than a friend over the past months, though neither of them had put a name to it yet. They would sit at the small table with food between them and talk about the memorial, about the workers who were being remembered, about the future that was being built on the bones of the past. "You are going to be a celebrity after this," Grace said one evening, pushing a container of pasta across to him. "National news coverage, book deals probably. How does that feel?" "Terrifying," Will admitted. "All I wanted was to prove my grandfather existed. Now people want to make him into a symbol." "He was a symbol." Grace's voice was gentle but firm. "Maybe not the one you wanted, but symbols matter. Stories matter. What happened to your grandfather happened to thousands of other men. Now their families get to know the truth." Will picked at his food. "I keep thinking about what he would say if he could see all this. The memorial, the museum, the Secretary of the Navy apologizing. Would he even want it?" "I think," Grace said slowly, "that he would want what every person wants, to be remembered for the work they did, to know that their life meant something. You gave him that." "We gave him that," Will corrected. "You and Marcus and Janelle and Pastor Stone. Even Joseph Brennan 80 years ago. We all did it together." Grace reached across the table and took his hand. "That is how it should be. Memory is not something one person carries alone. It is something we build together." The morning of the dedication ceremony dawned clear and cold. The kind of November day that made the Pacific Northwest look like it belonged on a postcard. Will dressed in the suit Marcus had helped him pick out. Something simple and dark that made him look less like a welder and more like someone who was about to speak in front of 500 people and a dozen television cameras. His hands shook as he tied his tie. Marcus had to redo it for him twice before it looked right. "You are going to be fine," Marcus said. "Just tell them what you told Janelle. Tell them about Grandpa Emmett." "What if I forget what to say?" "Then you look at that wall with his name on it, and remember why you are here." They drove to the memorial site together, arriving early to find the place already transformed. Rows of white chairs faced a temporary stage. Television trucks lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky. People in official-looking clothes hurried back and forth carrying clipboards and speaking into headsets. But it was the wall that stopped Will in his tracks. The black granite caught the morning light and threw it back transformed, each engraved name standing out in sharp relief against the polished stone. Will walked toward it slowly, Marcus beside him, until he stood close enough to touch. He ran his fingers across the surface, feeling the grooves where the letters had been cut deep into the granite, permanent and undeniable. The names were arranged in 4 columns, hundreds of them, a roll call of men who had built ships in this place. Will's eyes went to the H section automatically, and there it was. Hayes, Emmett James, 1918 to 1987, first-class welder, builder of Liberty. Below it, 3 lines down, another name. Hayes, James Emmett, 1946 to 2019, son of a builder, keeper of memory. Will's father, Marcus, had arranged to have him added to the wall, even though James Hayes had never worked at the shipyard himself, because he had carried his father's story when no one else would listen, because he had made sure his son knew the name Emmett Hayes even when the world said that name did not matter. And beside his father's name, in letters identical to all the others, was one more. Brnnan Joseph Anthony, 1897 to 1992, foreman, keeper of truth. Will stood before the wall with tears running down his face, not bothering to hide them, not caring who saw. This was what memory looked like. This was what legacy meant. Names in stone that would outlast lies, that would carry truth forward into a future these men had not lived to see. Marcus put a hand on his shoulder, and they stood together in silence until the crowds began to arrive. By 11 the site was full, every chair occupied and more people standing in the back. Will recognized faces from the past 6 months. Pastor Elijah Stone sat in the front row, wearing his clerical collar and looking proud. Grace was there with her sons. Janelle Morrison sat with her notebook ready, still gathering material for her book. And in a place of honor near the stage sat an elderly woman with white hair and kind eyes, her hands folded in her lap. Siobhan Brennan, Joseph's daughter, the keeper of the letter. The ceremony began with speeches from officials, each one thanking the right people and saying the right things about history and justice and the importance of truth. The Secretary of the Navy spoke about the systematic discrimination that had denied recognition to black workers during World War II, and announced the formation of a commission to review records and restore names to official histories. Then it was Will's turn. He climbed the steps to the podium on legs that felt like they might give out, his speech folded in his pocket, his mouth dry. 500 faces looked back at him. Cameras pointed their black eyes in his direction, and there at the front, looking up at him with an expression of pure faith, sat his son. Will pulled out his speech, unfolded it, and looked at the words Grace had helped him write. They were good words, careful words, the kind of thing that would sound appropriate on the evening news. He folded the paper back up and put it in his pocket. "My grandfather's name was Emmett Hayes," he began, his voice rough but steady. "He was born in Louisiana in 1918 and came to Oregon during the Depression looking for work. He learned to weld in a shipyard in Portland and got so good at it that, when the war came, Joseph Brennan hired him to build Liberty ships right here on this spot." Will gestured to the ground beneath their feet. Emmett was one of 3 black welders at Brennan's shipyard. The other 2 were Charles Washington and James Dorsey. Together, they worked alongside white welders doing the same job, building the same ships, facing the same dangers. And when those ships went to war, the seams my grandfather welded held together through Atlantic storms and German torpedoes. Men came home alive because of the work he did. The crowd was silent, listening. But when the war ended, the government decided that my grandfather's contribution was not the kind of thing that should be remembered. They erased his name from the records. They cropped him out of photographs. They denied him commendations he had earned. And when he tried to find work after the war, they made sure no one would hire him because officially he had never been a welder at all. Will's voice grew stronger. "My grandfather spent the last 20 years of his life working as a janitor. He died in 1987 without ever welding again, and the country he had helped save never acknowledged what he had done." He paused, looking out at the faces watching him. But Joseph Brennan remembered. The foreman of this shipyard knew what was being done, and he fought back the only way he could. He built a chamber beneath the floor and he filled it with evidence, photographs, records, proof that could not be denied. And he sealed it up and waited for someone to come along who cared enough about truth to fight for it. Will's eyes found Siobhan in the crowd. Joseph Brennan died in 1992 without knowing if anyone would ever find what he had hidden. He spent 40 years protecting a secret he could not share. And when I found that chamber 6 months ago, when I opened those crates and saw my grandfather's face in those photographs, I finally understood what legacy really means. He looked at Marcus. "It means doing work that matters even when no one is watching. It means standing up for truth even when it costs you everything. It means believing that someday, somehow, the story will be told." His voice broke slightly. "This memorial is not just for my grandfather. It is for every person whose contribution was denied, every worker who built something important and was told they did not matter, every family that carried a story no one wanted to hear." Will gestured to the wall behind him. "These names will be here long after we are gone. They will be here to remind us that history is made by people like my grandfather and Joseph Brennan, ordinary people doing extraordinary work, and no amount of erasure can change what they built." He stepped back from the podium to find the entire crowd on their feet, applauding. But Will was not looking at them. He was looking at the wall, at his grandfather's name carved in granite, and thinking about a young man in welding leathers who had done perfect work in impossible circumstances, and had the grace to keep doing it even when recognition was denied. After the speeches, after the Secretary of the Navy formally apologized on behalf of the government, after the bell was hung in its place, and rung for the first time in 80 years, sending its voice across the river like a message to the past, Siobhan Brennan approached Will with an envelope in her hands. "My father wanted you to have this," she said in an accent that carried both Ireland and Oregon in its cadence. "He wrote it the year before he died." Will took the envelope with shaking hands. It was yellowed with age, sealed with wax that had cracked but not broken. Across the front, in handwriting he recognized from the logbook, were written 6 words. "For the grandson of Emmett Hayes." "May I?" Will asked, gesturing to a bench near the water's edge. Siobhan nodded. "I will wait here, take your time." Will sat on the bench with Marcus beside him and carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Joseph Brennan's precise script. He read it aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. To whoever finds this, if you are reading these words, then you have found the chamber I built beneath the shipyard floor. You have seen the photographs and read my logbook and know the truth about what happened here during the war. I hope you are someone who will understand why I did what I did, why I risked my business and my reputation to preserve evidence the government wanted destroyed. Your grandfather saved my life in 1944. We were on Hull 14, the USS John W. Brown, during her shakedown cruise when a steam line ruptured. I was in the compartment when it happened. The metal was heating fast, ready to explode, and I was trapped. Emmett Hayes came through the steam without hesitation. He pulled me out and sealed the rupture with a torch even though the heat was enough to melt steel. He saved me and he saved the ship. When I tried to get him a medal for it, the Navy refused. Said there was no record of any Negro welder named Emmett Hayes on that vessel. They had already started erasing him from history. I built the underground chamber in 1946 after they ordered me to destroy all evidence of the black workers. I could not destroy it. These men were my brothers in steel. They deserved better than to be forgotten. I sealed the evidence and I waited. I waited for someone to come along who would care enough to fight for the truth. I hoped it would be someone from Emmett's family, someone who would understand what he gave and what was taken from him. If that person is you, then I have a request. Tell his story. Tell the world what he built and what he sacrificed. Make sure his name is remembered. And know that your grandfather was the finest welder I ever worked with and one of the finest men I ever knew. He deserved recognition in his lifetime. Since he did not get it, make sure he gets it now. The letter was signed Joseph Anthony Brennan and dated March 15, 1991, 13 months before he died. Will folded the letter carefully and looked out at the river where Liberty ships had once been launched. He thought about Joseph Brennan writing these words in his final year, still hoping, still believing that someday someone would find what he had hidden. He thought about his grandfather saving a man's life and being denied a medal because his skin was the wrong color. He thought about the long chain of people who had carried this story forward through decades of silence. And he thought about the future, about children who would visit this memorial and see these names and learn that history was more complicated than they had been taught, about families who would find their own ancestors on that wall and know that their contributions mattered, about truth surviving even when it seemed impossible. Marcus put his arm around Will's shoulders. He did it, Dad. Joseph Brennan, he made sure the story survived. No, Will said quietly, we did it, all of us. Grandpa Emmett by doing the work, Joseph by preserving the evidence, Dad by telling me the stories, you by helping me fight. We all did it together. They sat on the bench as the sun climbed higher and the crowds began to disperse. Will noticed a familiar figure standing at the edge of the gathering, a man in his mid-40s who looked uncomfortable in a suit that did not quite fit. Cody Brennan, Joseph's great-nephew, the man who had tried to steal the artifacts months ago, driven by gambling debts and desperation. Cody caught Will's eye and nodded once, a gesture that carried both shame and something that might have been gratitude. Will had learned through Janelle that Cody had pleaded guilty to attempted theft, received probation and community service, and was now working as a tour guide at the Maritime Museum, his knowledge of shipyard history finally put to legitimate use. Some redemptions came slowly, imperfectly, but they came. Will nodded back. The story was large enough to hold even those who had tried to bury it. The memorial would open to the public tomorrow, and in the years to come thousands of people would walk through this space, would read the names on the wall, would ring the bell, would learn about the workers who had been erased and the people who had fought to remember them. But today it belonged to them, to Will and Marcus and the ghosts of men who had built ships in this place and asked only to be remembered for it. As the afternoon wore on, Will walked to the bell one more time. It hung in its cradle at the edge of the water, positioned so that anyone could reach it. The brass had been polished until it shone, and the inscription that Joseph Brennan had added in 1987 was clearly visible. Let this bell ring for all the men they tried to forget. Will grasped the rope and pulled. The bell rang out across the water, deep and resonant, carrying the voice of history across the Columbia River. It rang for Emmett Hayes and Charles Washington and James Dorsey. It rang for Joseph Brennan and James Hayes and every person who had carried truth through darkness. It rang for the work they had done, and the recognition they had been denied, and the legacy that had survived despite everything. And as the sound faded into silence, Will felt something he had been searching for his entire life finally settle into place. Not just proof that his grandfather had existed, not just vindication after years of being told he was chasing ghosts. Peace, the knowledge that he had done what needed to be done, that he had honored the men who came before him, that he had built something that would outlast him. Marcus came to stand beside him, ready to go home. Will looked at the memorial one more time, at the wall of names and the bell and the ground where a shipyard had once stood. This was home now. This place where truth had been buried and then uncovered. This place where ordinary men had done extraordinary work. This place where legacy lived in stone and brass and memory. "Yeah," he said finally, "I am ready." They walked to the parking lot together, father and son, their shadows long in the afternoon sun. Behind them, the Brennan Hayes Memorial stood silent and strong, a monument to work and sacrifice, and the stubborn refusal of truth to stay buried. The last riveter had been remembered, and his story, carried through decades of silence by people who believed that names mattered and work mattered and truth mattered above all, would echo into a future he had never lived to see. But somewhere in that future, Will thought, in the children who would visit this place and the families who would find their own stories reflected in these names, Emmett Hayes was still building, still welding perfect seams, still proving that the work of one person's hands, joined with the work of countless others, could create something strong enough to carry the weight of history. Something that would never rust, something that would never break, something that would hold together through any storm. The bell rang once more in the wind, unbidden, its voice carrying across the water like a promise kept.